Alrighty, so welcome to session 3 for the web dev course for ShieldConnect. And so as always, if you need to find the slides are going to be on the website. And if you need the exercise files, they will be on the GitHub. They'll be a little bit different from the ones that were originally listed for session 3, just because we swapped around session 3 a little bit. So if you want to grab the new files, you can grab them from the GitHub link right there. Okay, so first things first. So last time, after talking with everybody, it seemed like there was a couple of problems with some of the content. So a lot of it was way too fast, and a lot of it was really theoretical. And a lot of it was just really hard to kind of like glue all the concepts together. So today we're going to basically try to work to fix that. And we swapped around a lot of the content to try and approach those problems. So first things first, as we're going through, the intention wasn't really to have people like memorize all the things that were in there. I think a couple people had some problems where they're like trying to memorize all of the stuff in there. The intention with the slides is just to give you references. And then when you're working through some of those challenges, to be able to reference back to them. You don't have to like memorize any of the stuff. All of it's always a Google search away. And then on top of that, Bootstrap was essentially one of the main things that I wanted to get you guys prepared for. So what we're going to do today is we're going to be focusing on Bootstrap, but we're going to be focusing on it from a much more practical perspective, mostly talking about what would you actually use the things for and how can you get them up and running quickly, essentially, is what we're going to be talking about today. And then on top of that, anything that's going to be purely referential from now on is going to have a green bar at the top, because it seems like some people were confused as to whether or not some of the slides were intended to be like things that they should be stopping and reading, or whether they're just like there for you guys to look at afterwards. So anything with a green bar at the top basically means you can take a look at it after the session if you're interested, but it's not going to be a huge deal if you don't know it. So practicing what we preach, memorizing code is bad. So there's two ways to kind of avoid it, especially when you're working with frameworks, because there's this whole ton of CSS and HTML code that gets built into frameworks. So there's two ways to basically get rid of that. One is to just go to the documentation and copy and paste everything, but sometimes that's kind of annoying. So another approach that we're going to talk about today is using plugins in VS Code with snippets. So essentially on your VS Code, there is a snippet if you go into your extensions. So the same way that we installed some of the extensions for Python earlier. Basically, if you just come into this little box right here and click on that, if you just type in Bootstrap 5 quick snippets, there is a plugin right here that you can install. And this will get rid of a lot of the boilerplate code. Like if we want to set up a document, we just type that in and it does it for us, puts all the code in there for us. We don't have to worry about trying to type everything out all the time or going back to the website constantly and trying to find things. So today we're going to be including not only links to the documentation, but also just the information about which snippets you can use in the plugin to do the things that we're going to be talking about. So you can spend less time trying to read and find everything and feel like you're getting stressed out during the exercises. And there's a link to it right here. So if you click on this link, it'll take you to the web page version of it, which you can then install directly through VS Code. And yeah, so I just showed you how it works. But yeah, essentially most of the snippets that you're going to be dealing with today are going to have BS5 at the beginning of them because that's for Bootstrap 5. So it's going to be BS5 and then dash and then something. So the first one here, the $ is going to be the basic template for a page. And then you can see there's a ton of other stuff with all the different things from Bootstrap in it right there. So you don't have to go through and keep constantly Googling, card in Bootstrap 5. You can just use the plugin right there to do that. So last time, again, we covered a ton of topics. We covered pseudo selectors, we covered myriad queries, layouts, CSS frameworks, and we started getting into some JavaScript. And today what we're going to do is we're going to redo Bootstrap from a very different perspective, talking about what you can practically use things for and give you more time to actually work on some actual exercises with it. And then after that, we're going to go into JavaScript and start talking about it in more detail. But starting off, first things first, we have a quick question. So which of the lines of text in here would be visible based on the CSS and the HTML that you're seeing here? So I'll give it a moment for that question to pop up. Okay, I think that's everyone. So in this case, this one would be C, so it'd be lines 10 and 11. So in this case, because this is the subtitle class on here, the background color would be white. And because of the fact that we have the actual color of the paragraph tags as being white, in this case, this one would be hidden right here. And then for 11, we have dot dark being drawn here, which would have a color black. So the actual text itself would be black. And then because it's inside of a dot background div, the actual background for it would be black as well. So it would hide that text as well. So that one was a pretty hard one. And then we have another one here, which is which of the lines would be visible on this one. So we'll give you guys a bit longer to try this one out. Okay, I think that's everyone. Oh, there we go. Last one came in. Okay. So yes, in this case, it would be D, which is 11, 14, and 16. So go ahead and actually pull this one up. You can see it right here. So it would be this first one right here, this one, and this one. So it's all the ones that are basically in between. So if we're taking a look at the actual code itself, this second one right here where it says as is this. So this one has a dot dark tag. So that would mean that the color of the actual text itself is white. And it's on a background, which has the background color being white. So this one would be hidden. And then in this case, these other two that are hidden right here is a similar story where basically the color is white and the background itself is white. Okay. So let's get started. So yeah, we're going to go through and we're going to do Bootstrap again, except for this time we're going to actually build a site. So as we're going through, we're going to get you guys to build out a site through each of the exercises and go from there instead of just sort of plugging and playing with some existing code that's in there. So to start off with, we're going to look at a familiar face. And as we're going through, we're going to be taking a look at a ton of other examples of sites so that you can see exactly how these different components are actually used in the real world to get a better idea of how you can use them in any of your own projects. Because that's really the goal at the end of this, is that whenever you want to do your own web development and down the road, you'll be able to actually use these patterns yourself. So the first problem with any website is helping your users get around. Assuming that you don't just have a single page site, although sometimes navigations can be useful for that too, you'll have to have some way for people to actually get to the pages on your site. And so the good way of doing that is navbars. So as you can see here, we have the two different types of navbars. Well, they're the same navbar, but one of the handy things about Bootstrap is that it automatically makes it mobile friendly for us. So as we're going through, we can essentially have all of our links at the top of a page. And it's actually two different approaches to doing this. So one is if you have multiple pages, you can have links to those pages be the anchor tags that are inside of a navbar. Or alternatively, if you have one page that's really long, like let's say, for example, you have a portfolio site, you have a ton of information in there, you have like a bunch of projects and all that sort of stuff in there, then what you can actually do is, like I showed you before, when you have an ID, if you have an anchor tag, you can actually link to the to whatever the ID element that you have is, and it'll actually take them to that spot in the page. So people will sometimes have links where they'll have like education, you click it and it takes you to the education div that they have on the page, and then it'll show them that content. So we have the navbars documentation there, but if you want to ever actually use a navbar, we can actually use that plugin that I was talking about earlier. So if we're in here, we can say BS5, and then we can say $$ to open up just a regular Bootstrap 5 page. And then from there, it actually gives you comments directly in here where you can see place navbar here. So if we go ahead and we type in BS5 and then dash navbar, there are a couple of different options. I believe the correct one is navbar default. And so if we take a look at this page now, you can see here we have the navbar at the top. And as we shrink this down, you'll see it'll eventually become mobile where it drops down in there. And then as you're looking at this code, you can tell there's a whole bunch of code in here. The main thing that I would say when working with a lot of the stuff with Bootstrap is play around with it and just delete and remove stuff, change stuff around, and you'll see how a lot of it operates. So as we're looking at this, for example, you can see here we have like this drop down, which seems kind of complicated. If you take a look at the actual page, you can see here, okay, this is what it's doing. And there's these sections in here. And then as we're following it along, we can sort of see what these different pieces are. So let me just quickly go back to the page. So yeah, and then the actual navbar documentation itself, if we click on it, you can see there are a ton of different options for navbars, and it has all the different documentation for all the different ways that you can implement a different navbar, as well as these chunks of code that you can just copy and paste into your project as you're going. So we'll talk about this a little bit later with buttons, but there's actually two different types of buttons. So there are the CSS class, which exists in Bootstrap, and then there is the HTML element. So the CSS class can also be applied to anchor tags. And then there's actually a button element in HTML. So either of those will need the classes. Even for an HTML button, you will need the class of class button to use it. But the important distinction is that typically the CSS class, when it's applied to an anchor tag, is used to link people to other pages, whereas the button is used to do things in the same page that you're currently on, and typically to control what shows up. So just as an example of where this matters, if we look at these this navbar here, when we shrink this down, this right here, if we go ahead and actually expand this back out and we open up the dev tools and we shrink down our page a little bit, if we actually inspect this element right here, you can see here, it's actually a button. And most of those fancy interactions that you're going to see on a page will be controlled by a button, because as we'll see later on, it's much easier to control a button with JavaScript than it is to control an anchor tag with JavaScript. So just keep that in mind when you're taking a look at stuff, is that when something has a class of button on it, it doesn't mean that it's always the same button that you're looking at. You have to look at the element as well as the class. So like I said before, when we're taking a look at that, there is a button built into these navigation bars. The most important part of this is the ID. So you can see here in this button, when we're looking at these attributes inside the elements, there is a data-bs-target. And you can see here it has hash navbar nav. So the hash is the same thing as a CSS selector, where the hash indicates that it's an ID. And then we're saying navbar nav. And then this is where the actual ID shows up. So as we're taking a look at the code that we have in here, for example, if we go back up to the top, and we take a look, this one's a little bit different. This one says collapsible nav ID, but we can see here, this has the collapsible nav ID. This has hash collapsible nav ID. So whenever we click this button, what it's doing is it's using that to locate this div right here to show up when we're going mobile. So that's basically what controls the collapsing as we're going through it on mobile. So that's the thing that really you need to make sure you have down when you're doing nav bars, is that those IDs match. Otherwise, what you'll find is that when you click that, nothing will happen. And it won't give you any errors or anything because there's no errors to be found. So now that we actually have the nav bars, at this point, how do we actually make a good first impression? So there's a ton of different ways of going about this, but one of the main ones is for Bootstrap, they actually have this page that you can go to that are examples, where there's just a ton of different like pre-built elements for you that you can go through, and you're allowed to just basically use those in your projects as you want. So if you want to do a cover, for example, then you could do that. You just right click, and then you can just grab these elements and you can copy them in and use them that way. But the one that's more common to use at the top of a page is going to be heroes, which we have a link to in there as well. And so essentially these elements are what you'd use at the top of a page. So the easiest way to use these is if you just right click and then inspect the element. You can see here as we're looking through, it'll highlight which part of the element that you're currently on. And if you just go up to this div, this is basically just this top one right here. And then from there, we could just copy it and we can just chuck it into our code. So now that our header is over, we can go inside this main element here, paste it in there. And if we refresh, now we have that stuff in there. So that's the best way to use those example pages. I use those all the time as a starting point for my projects. And it's a really good way to start off your project without having to write a ton of code right off the bat. And so, but basically the hero blocks themselves, or the hero components, the idea behind them is that they're supposed to be eye-catching. So typically these are going to be the things that are going to draw users into the page. So what you want to do is make sure that they're actually interesting and engaging to look at. So for us, for the Shield Ignite site, for example, we have that big red bit at the top with the diagonal line. That's our head. That's our hero at the top there. For the U Calgary, there's a ton of different options for heroes, but this is one of them right here where you got a bright image and stuff like that. And then this one, we have a big picture of a phone that captures people's attention. Essentially, you just want to sort of get people to actually want to stick around, because that's kind of the point of building the website. There's no point in having a website if nobody else wants to see it. So, okay, so what we're going to do here is you guys are going to go out and pick a topic for your site. The site that I'm going to be building is going to be called Pear, which is a fake technology company based around sort of the same ideas like Apple. But you guys can pick whatever topic you want. And what we're going to do is we're going to start building sites. So the first thing that you're going to do right now is build in a nav bar and a hero at the top of your page. And you can make it about whatever you want. There's a couple of different suggestions here, but you can ultimately make it whatever you want. You can make it a resume site if you want. It doesn't really matter. So yeah, you're going to have a couple minutes to give that a shot. Resume the recording. Okay, so yeah, so taking a look at this, basically this is the one that I currently have set up for there. So yeah, super exciting. Just a couple of links up here. And then we just have the same hero that you saw from before, and then I've just put an image of a pair that I found. If you are looking for images, actually, I'll post this link in chat. There is a site called unsplash.com. And basically what you can do with this is if you need any photos ever, you can come here. They're essentially all copyright free. So when you click on one, you can just right click and hit copy image link, and you can just post that as the source to your image tag as you're going through. And you can use any of these as you like. Okay. So now that we got them hooked, the question is, what are we going to do? So the first question is, when you guys are looking at this, besides being boring, I assume most of you would be willing to actually read the content that's here. Like, it's not very long. It's pretty easy to get through. It's a couple of sentences. It's not too bad. Now, what about this one? How many of you would actually really be bothered to actually get through all of this content? And believe me, as somebody who helps people set up websites on a regular basis, this is the stuff that I see a lot. Is somebody will come in, they will go through, and they will just copy like 7 or 8 paragraphs, and they'll just post it somewhere. This happens a lot with, especially with researchers and stuff like that. So what about this one? Obviously, it's in Latin. So besides the fact of not being able to read the Latin, yeah, but this one is much easier to read, right? As you're coming through, it's much easier to sort of dodge between different sections and understand what's happening. Now, here's the thing. The one on the right actually has significantly more content than the one on the left. I think it's actually 20, I think it's either 25 or 30% more content than the one on the left. So there's actually more text on the right, but it's much easier to get through because of the way that it's laid out. And this is a weird thing that happens. It's a design principle that is just, when you break up text, it makes it much easier to read, much easier to understand when people are going through it. So the question is, how do we actually break up our text to make it easier to get through? Well, other than like the splashes of color that we had, we can get pretty far by just literally breaking them up into columns. The section on the left is the exact same length as the section on the right, except it feels less long because they're sectioned up into little chunks as you're going. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to talk about Bootstrap Grid, which will help us to actually break up our sections into little chunks to make it easier to be able to understand what's happening on your site. So the first thing is that there are 2 classes and 2 divs that you have to use if you want to have it work out nicely. So the first, this outer div that you can see here, is going to have a class of container. And basically what this does is it adds a little bit of extra styling to make things a little bit nicer. It just keeps things a little bit more compact. You can use this by just saying bs5-grid-container and then hitting enter. So if I show you that on here, for example, if we just come into this one and we come down here, we can just say bs5-grid container, and that'll just basically add that in there. And then this is the snippet if we want to add a row, which is the next thing that we'll be talking about, which is bs5-grid-row, and that'll add in a row for us. Actually, with that one, make sure, because I just did it actually, make sure that you don't hit this first one, hit the second one right here, and then that'll add in the row for you. But essentially, that's what you want to have. So you want to have a container, then a row, and then inside that is where our content is going to be. And the content is going to be columns. So there's a big grid that's laid out essentially for you in a 12 column layout. So there's essentially 12 individual columns across the page. And then from there, you can then split that up however you need to. So for example, if you have 4 columns, then what that means is you can get 3 different sections in there, because 4 3s are 12. So you'd have 1 4 column div here, 1 4 column div here, 1 4 column div here, and that would make up your entire 12 columns worth of space on the page. And that's basically how you'd break things up. So if you wanted to do a 50-50, you'd basically have column 6, and then there you go. Any overflows will break lines. So if you accidentally add in like a column 6 and a column 7, then that's 13. So what'll happen is you'll have one that takes up 50% of the line, and then one that takes up 7/12 of the line on the next line from there. So just keep that in mind when you're going through. But there's actually an easier way to do this, which is just if you put just call as your class name in your div, it will just automatically divide it for you, and you don't have to worry about it. So as we're coming through here, you can see here we have the container that I was talking about right here. We then have our row, and then we have the columns inside that row. And in this case, because this is just one column, it's called call, it'll just always be 12 columns. But then in this case, we have 3 columns here. So you can see we have 3 divs with call there. They'll always be 4. So they'll always take up a third of the space each. And if you added in 6, then they'll take up a 1/6 of the space, so on and so forth. So using that principle, you can see here, we have just some text here, or we can split it up into the 4 column layouts, the 4 column layouts here. So you can see from this side, it's just a paragraph, but on this side, we have the container, the row, and then we just have 1, 2, 3 columns, and then it splits it up into 3 columns for us. So super easy to use. Just make sure that you have the container in the row, and then just put your columns in there as you go. And then if you want to get a little bit more fancy, this is the exact same idea that we have. The only difference is instead of just using a paragraph tag, on this side, we've put an H4, which is kind of like our subtitle that we've put right here. And then we've just put a paragraph tag inside there. But this is the exact same code as this last slide, where we just have the columns and then we have the content inside them. The only difference is that we've added an extra tag, which is for the subheading right here. So as you're going through, you can have whatever you want as being like the big thing at the top there as in like an H4 or an H3 or whatever size you want. And then underneath that, have your paragraph tag with your actual main content that goes underneath it like that. Okay, so what we're going to do is get you guys to go through and just implement that. So go ahead and give it a shot. Try making a set of columns. You can make it however many you want. You can do either the 3 column layout like we have there, or you can do 4, whatever you want. Just try that out, and then also try it out with using the H4 or different sizes of text in your sections there. And you can just make up whatever you want to put in there for the content. So take a look at that. Basically, this is what I just had on mine. So we just had some basic text just out to the bottom here. I think actually, let me just see. This should work on here. Annotations. So you should be able to see this. If I draw this, can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, so essentially the easy way to think about this and to remember the way the classes work out is that this is your actual row, and then it's split up into a grid system essentially. So this is your row, and then these are your columns through here. So as we're coming through here, we can see this is our row, and then in that row, we have a 4 column right here, 4 column right here, and a 4 column right here. That's the easiest way to remember these classes as you're going through them, is that this is going to be the row, and then these are the actual columns that are in between them. Okay. So I think that, yeah, cool. Okay, so what if we actually want to spice these up and make them a little bit less or a little bit more interesting than just some plain text? What you can do is you can chuck in this CSS in your head. So I have this link right here. So this is just the content, and all you want to do is just basically copy that and chuck that into the head right here. So in your head tag, just chuck that in there. And then from there, what you'll be able to do is use icons. So as you can see here, we have just plain text, or we have some icons that we can use in there. As you're going through, you can actually find, so I have right here, there's the reference site here. When you come in here, you can just basically go through, find an icon that you want to use. Let's say, for example, I want to use this one, click on it, and here's the HTML for it right there. And then you just copy and paste that into your page, and you're good to go. So basically you can do that for any of the icons that you want to be able to use. And then you just have that I and then the class and put it in there. And the class is going to be whatever the actual name of the icon is. One thing to keep in mind is that icons are text, so you can scale them the same way as you would with text. You make the font size larger, they get larger. So if you put them inside of an H4 tag, for example, they become H4 sized. So you can essentially just nest them inside of another tag like that to make them a little bit larger or change the color or do whatever you want with them. So if you're going to use multiple columns as well, the other thing is that sometimes it's good to change the alignment. So you can see here we have the alignment and it's set to the left, which is the default. But what we can do is we can actually set it to the center instead. So as you can see here with the center, we now have the icon on the top here, and then we have the things that are sat underneath them. This typically looks a lot nicer when you're looking at and in a grid. So what you can do for that is you essentially just add a text center class to any of the divs that you have inside there. So you can see here, typically you'll put this inside the column because you would want everything inside that column to be centered, but you can put it anywhere you want. So if you only want one piece of text to be centered, so if you only want the heading to be centered, for example, you could put it inside this H4 and then it would be centered in there, or you could put it wherever you want to make whatever you want centered. So here's just some examples of what this kind of look like at the end of it. So you can see here we have all of this is centered on the Shulk Ignite site, and then we have an image on the top, and then we just have essentially an H4 tag there, and then we have some text underneath it. And then this is at the University of Calgary. They instead have it all left aligned, and you can see here everything is just set up from there. So it's basically just handy to put all of your content in some sort of a grid array, so it's much easier to deal with. So what you're going to want to do now is we're going to try out using some icons and try out also if you can use some colors. So for color wise, you can just use the font color, and for size wise, you can use either font size or you can put it inside of an H4, whichever way you want to go about it. So yeah, for mine, basically all that I did for mine was I had the exact same stuff. I just added in the icons at the top here. And then I also changed the color so that it matched the color of the pair. So I just had the H1 and H4 in the style tag here, just being set to a certain color. And then I upped the font size to a 2EM. So it's a little bit larger right there. So there's actually a lot that you can do just with those basic pieces. You can make sites that are much more interesting than just the plain, wall of here's all of your text all at once sort of thing. So moving on from there, though, what about if you want to get a little bit fancier? So cards are the most common way for you to actually group a bunch of content together, and they come in a ton of different shapes and sizes. So the main one that we're going to be looking at is similar to this, but you can see here, these are all different types of cards. So you can see this is a type of card right here where it's just sort of a dark background with a nice little gradient behind it. These are cards. These are cards from the Shulk Ignite sites where we've gone ahead and mess around with the styling on the top here for the title. And then also these are cards as well that have images on the top of them. So there's a ton of different ways that you can use cards, but cards effectively just refer to a thing that kind of has a border and generally speaking is a grouping of some sort of content. So at its core, cards are basically just divs. So there's the div that has a class of card, and then they'll have a body that has a title and some text on them as well. So this is like the most basic card that you can get. And then obviously you can scale all the way up to really, really complicated cards that exist. Generally speaking, though, you tend to use them in groups. And so there's some different ways to use them. So let me just quickly grab my slides here. But if we're taking a look at it, you can grab it from the documentation if you want, or the easier way to do it is you can actually just use BS5-card grid, which is the abbreviation for doing a grid by default. So if we do BS5-card-grid, and make sure not this Emmet abbreviation, you want to ignore this, you want to do this one right here. So the BS5 card grid. And now you can see here, it's made us a row, but it hasn't made us a container. So we'd want to add a container to the top of this as well. So if we just do div.container, which is the abbreviation to make a div that has a class of container, and put that at the bottom there, now you can see, okay, now we're back to where we were before. And you can see in here, this is a really weird situation, but you can see there the columns are -4, but there's only 2 of them. So if we actually go ahead and pop that open, let me grab the page. There it is. If we grab that open, it's actually just kind of sitting here. So not the best sort of default setup, but what we can do from there is we can actually just add in an extra card. And if you're finding that these divs are hard to understand, which one goes to where, you can see here that we have this div If I come all the way across, there'll be a little arrow. I can click that drop down and it'll give me just the section that it's controlling, and I can hide that section. So if I want to grab just an extra card to put in there, I can copy that, paste that in there, and it'll have all the content from that card. And then now if I refresh this, we'll see here, now we have a 3-column layout. So it's a bit of a weird oddity that they have it set up so that it goes with 2 4 columns, but that's how it works by default. So just keep that in mind if you're going to use that, abbreviation. And then colors, size, everything like that. Essentially, the easiest way to find these is if you actually just click on the documentation for the card here. You can see here card styles is one of the links that we have there. And you can see, you know, if I wanted to change the color to, let's say, this black, if I scroll down to the bottom here, we can see here it says text dark BM3. So if I go ahead and copy that and put that on one of my cards here, and then come back to here and refresh, you'll see here now this card's dark. And basically for any of those components that we've looked at, if you want to look at the different colors and stuff, on the right-hand side, we'll have all of these sort of different sections of the documentation for the component that you're currently on. And typically there'll be either a CSS or there'll be one that says styles, and it'll tell you the information about how to do different colors and how to change the stylings around. And you can see even on here, there's like different ones with images and a bunch of other stuff for cards. So you can take a look at those as we're going. And then the next question is, what about mobile? So you can see here that one of the main advantages of Bootstrap in general is not just that it has CSS, but it also has CSS that works well on mobile. So you can see here, it resizes as we go down, and as we change the size of the device, it'll change as well. And so the way that this works is there's essentially these different little tags you can put on there. So it's essentially going to be column dash, whatever the sizing that you're trying to target is, and then dash whatever the size of the amount of columns that you take up at that given size. So col dash small dash 12 would be 100% width at anything less than 576. Or if we had col dash MD dash 6, then what it would mean is that anytime that it is greater than or equal to 768 pixels, it would be 6 columns. And you can just stack these to build out your layout so that they look different for a tablet view versus a mobile view versus a desktop view. Typically, medium is used for tablets, small is used for mobile devices, large is used for desktops. And then, yeah, this is just explains the exact same thing. So for example, .col-medium-4 would be 4 columns until 768, and then it would default back to 12 if there wasn't anything else added to it. But if you added on there .col-small-whatever, then that would take over instead of the 12 column default. So looking at this code, for example, so we can see here we have our col-small-12 and then col-large-6. So whenever it's on desktop, it'll take up 6 columns. That's what the large is here. So it'll take up 6 columns on desktop, and then on mobile, it'll take up 12. So it'll take up the full page when you go onto mobile, or it'll take up just half the page when you're on desktop. So what we're going to do is go ahead and add in some cards. You can add into whatever layout you want, 3, 4, whatever you want, and then basically try to add in some mobile support for it as well. So add in some small column sizes, as well as either medium and large, or just medium, whatever you want. And yeah, just try and make it work for mobile. So with this one, yeah, basically it's just the exact same as that example image you can see here, where basically I've gone ahead and I've made a 4-column layout, and then essentially once it gets down to medium, it's just going through and going back down to 6 for the cards, and then for these ones, it's going from it's basically doing the same thing. And then from here, as we go down further, it goes down to 12 once you get to mobile. Pretty much always you're going to end up with 12 at mobile. It's very rare that you ever want to not have 12 at mobile. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing things. And these last 2 are just going to be for your information if you're interested. So accordions, these are also often ones that are super useful to have around, mostly for FAQs and stuff like that. If you have a bunch of information, you can essentially click them and they'll drop down some text and they'll hide it otherwise. So you can take a look at those if you're interested. They work the same way as the navbar toggler does. And then on top of that, we have a footer. So these are just handy to let people know where to find you. So if you have social media or anything like that, it's always handy to put a footer at the bottom of the page so people know where to look. A lot of people do this by default when they're going on sites. Now, off of the CSS and into the JavaScript. So we talked about this a bit last time, but we'll go over a little bit again so that we can actually get through all of it all at once. So whenever somebody asks for a web page, basically they get that web page back. And the question is, what can we do once we actually get the web page back if we want to run some code on there? So JavaScript is going to be the system that allows us to do that. It lets you run code directly on the page and lets you modify the page directly with the code that you can run. So essentially JavaScript defines the dynamic behaviors. Any verbs that are on the page will be a JavaScript function most likely. And like, for example, if you had a button where every time that you click it, it's going through and upping the number by 1, that's going to be JavaScript as you're going through. So yeah, it's basically the exact same as a CSS file. You can use it in a tag with a script tag or as a JS file, or you can write it in browser using the console. Syntax wise, for anybody from Python, might be a little bit different, but you essentially end the lines with a semicolon. This actually isn't necessarily required, but I would recommend doing it anyways, because some browsers will behave differently than others when you don't do that. And then curly braces are used to control your function bodies. In Python, this would be the same idea as indentation level. So you can see here, this return that's inside here is inside of a curly brace. That was defined what is inside the function is these 2 curly braces here, not the indentation like would with Python if you're used to doing that. Continue on with the syntax. There's everything you'd expect: strings, integers, floats, arrays, JSON, which is a different type of thing that you've probably seen. It's essentially a hash map or a dictionary, depending on which language you come from. Essentially, you have some sort of key, you have a value. Whenever you ask for JSON of the specific key in square brackets, so if you say JSON and then square brackets, you have name, it'll return the string here. So it's essentially just what's called a key value pair mapping. So as you go through, you provide the key, it gives you the value back. And then on top of that, there are these conversions, which is you can basically convert strings to ints using parse int and strings to float using parse float. So you just pass in the strings and then they'll do those conversions for you. This is the same stuff that we covered last time. And then on top of that, with the for loops, you have the C style for loops, which is down here, which is basically just you go through, you start up an index, you go through 1 by 1, and then you can access the arrays 1 by 1 using array of that given index. In Python, this is the same thing as doing for I in range, and then you say whatever the list is of that, like at that given index, and it'll go through and it'll find those for you. For each are Python style loops, which look like this. So you say const element of array. That'll basically make each of the values of the array into the element as you go. So with this array, you'll have 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. Keep in mind, you can't change any of the values. Like if you make any changes to those values, it won't update in the array. If you want to make changes to the values in the array, you have to use these style of loops. And then there's while loops that work with conditionals. And then speaking of conditionals are a little bit different. So if you are coming from Python, they'll be quite a bit different. Instead of using words like or and, you would do things like using 2 ampersands, or you use 2 bars to say or. And then if you want to say not, it would be an exclamation point. And then as you're going through, there are a couple different types of saying equal to. So there's 2 equals, which means equals to. There is exclamation point equals, which means not equal to. And then there's these ones that have the extra equal sign on the end. JavaScript, you don't have to put any types in for any of your stuff. And so what'll happen is with these 2 equal signs, what it means is that it will kind of fuzzy find whatever you're looking for. So if you say, for example, that like x is equal to 5, and then you say x is double equal to 5, in this case with an integer, it works. And then if it's double equal to 5 as a string, it'll also work because it will convert it to an integer and then compare it. Whereas this, with the triple equal signs, is a strict comparison, which means it has to be the same value and the same type. So it won't try and do any converting. It won't try and do anything for you. It will strictly convert these things across. And if you want to do the not equals to version of strictly checking, then you do a not and then 2 equal signs instead of 1. And then greater than and equal to are the same as they would be in any other language. And then on top of that, if you want to write a function, instead of using def, if you're from Python, you use function, say whatever the function name is, and then you put in the parameters that you want. And you can specify default parameters the same way you can in Python as well. And then you can return them using the same keyword. Okay, so one thing I'll show you here. So I mentioned the console, but basically, if you go in and you inspect the page on any page, then you'll see here, it's great that Microsoft doesn't clean up any of their errors like good developers do. I don't either, to be fair. But basically in the console here, you can click this little button to clear if you need to clear out those errors. But in the console here, you can directly write JavaScript. So if you want to say x is equal to 5, you can just do that right in here on the page with JavaScript. And so what we're going to do here is, based on what you've seen so far, give a shot at trying to convert a number initially that starts from 0 as a string to an integer, then run through with some sort of loop, and then add 1 to it every time and get it to 10. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. All right, so go through this example. So if we have the console open, so if you have a string like x, for example, equal to 0, we can go ahead and we can make this into an integer using x is equal to parse int. And you can see here in the browser, the handy thing is that it gives you this autocomplete that's showing up there. So we can just go ahead and hit tab, and then we're just going to go ahead and put in x in this case. And if we hit enter, we'll see now x is integer. And we can say while x is less than 10, for example, we can just go through, we can do x plus equals to 1. And then we can use a function called console.log to actually see the results of each of those as we're going through. So we can console.log the x value and then end it off. Make sure you end it off with the extra squiggly brace there. And then we run through that. You can see here, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And obviously being able to do, a whole bunch of addition and stuff like that is, super exciting. But the real power of JavaScript is being able to actually access stuff on the page. That's the big thing, is being able to update the pages as you go. So there are two different objects that actually exist in JavaScript that are super important. The first is the document object. This lets you actually interface with the any of the elements or any of the objects that are actually on the screen. And then the window object, which lets you interface more directly with the browser. This is things like the screen size, all of that sort of stuff, the internal database, the URL, the things that are kind of what we call above the fold. So you can see here in this picture, everything that's at the top of the page here. So like all of this stuff at the top of my screen right here would be the window. And then this stuff inside here would be the document, essentially. So first things first, when we're using the window, you can basically just use window dot and then to access its attributes. So in this case, window dot location is the attribute that controls the URL on the page. And you can go ahead and you can get the current URL by just doing window dot location, or you can reset it by just saying window dot location dot href equals to something else. So that's the same thing that we saw on anchor tags, for example, is whenever we have that href, essentially what's happening is that when you click that, it's changing the window dot location dot href value of your window. And then that will change, that will send you to a new place. So this is what you can do to redirect users to somewhere else if you want to in JavaScript. On top of that, the window then also has different options for finding out the screen size. So there is the inner height and the outer height. So if you have the outer height and outer width, then that essentially counts everything, including this top bar here. So generally speaking, it's kind of a useless measurement, but some people still use it. It's a really bad idea too, because if somebody has a ton of toolbars, then essentially it'll take up extra space and then you'll get a bunch of readings that won't be very helpful to you. So I typically recommend using the inner height, which just includes the actual document height, and the inner width, which just includes the document width as well. This stuff, again, this is reference. You don't have to worry about this, but if you need a database ever, there is one built into the browser. And then after the window, so now that we talked about the window, which is everything that's kind of to do with the browser itself, we now have the document. And so with the document has, there's a word called DOM that gets thrown around a lot. It's called the document object model. Essentially, the page and the content of the page is inside what's called this document object. So you essentially have an object that has all the elements inside of it as attributes from there. And so basically, once you understand that and the document itself is an object, you essentially just need to modify that object in order to change anything that shows up on the page. So the first thing to do if you want to update and modify some elements is to find them. So there's a couple different ways to find them. You can get them by class name. So this will basically get an array of elements. So any of the ones that say get elements by will have an array. Anything that says element by, which is just the ID, will return a single element. So this is why having just one ID on a page is important, because this is expecting there to only be one thing. So getting the document by the ID will just return the one element object. Getting it by class name or tag name or anything like that will return multiple objects. So if I actually go to the SheilaCognite page, for example, and let's say, I actually don't think any of these have IDs, which makes this more awkward. But if I wanted to, for example, get all the different span tags that are available on here, then what I could do is I could say document.get elements by, and I can say tag name. And then let's say I actually just want to get the divs instead. I could say get all of the divs. That'll give me a ton. There's apparently 47 on this page. And if I want to get the first one, I would just get the 0th element like that. And you can see here, it'll actually highlight it for me in the browser so I know which one I'm looking at. So this is the first div that shows up anywhere on the page. And then if you want to do it by ID or anything like that, you basically just change this to get element by ID, and then you type in whatever the ID is, and you'll be able to find them that way. This is why using IDs is super handy for people who are using JavaScript, because we're lazy and we don't want to have to search through a whole bunch of arrays to try and find where a certain element is. So definitely worth it to use IDs whenever you're going through and doing programming yourself. So once you've actually found the element, you can set it to something. So in this case, for example, we have an H1 tag right here that has a title ID. We can go ahead, document.getElement by ID title, and we can actually find this element, set it to the title element variable here. And then once it's inside here, we can check the tag name, which would be H1. We can check the inner text, which is all of the text inside here. And then we can check the inner HTML, which would include all the actual HTML. So you can see here, this hello portion is inside a different tag. So in the inner HTML, it shows up as a different tag in here, but in the inner text, it's all the tags have been stripped away and only the text is showing up inside there. So keep that in mind. All of these are read and write, except for the tag name, which you can't change. That one's just read. You can only read the tag name, you can't change it. So the exercises for this one are in day 2, because if you remember, this is still content from day 2. So if you're going through and if you go into the day 2 folder under exercises, there is a button text starter file. So if you just go ahead and pop that open, try and find the inner text of the main content div. So there's a div that has an ID of content on it. So just try and find the inner text of that and then the inner HTML. And then head to SchuleIgnite and try and find the URL of the page and the inner and outer width of your browser. So we'll give you guys a chance to go try that out. So taking a look at this, so trying to find the inner content of this div. So I thought that there was an ID on it, but I was wrong. There's actually an ID on the text there. So that's my bad. So what we'd actually need to do in this case is we have to go document.getElements. And then it's going to be by tag name. In this case, we're going to look for the div. And then even though there's only one, I think there's only one on the page, we just need to do div 0, which will give us all of this. And we can actually see when we go inside here, that's this div right here. And then from that, we can do the .inner text or the .inner HTML. So you can see the .inner text here. We go ahead and look at it, has this \n, which basically means that it's like breaking to the new line. And then it's saying that the hello world exists here. And then there's a line break. And then there's this button, which here has the change text inside of it. And then if we did the inner HTML, we could see what all the inner HTML looks like from there, including the comment, which is what that /x3c is. So in the interest of time, we are going to do breakout rooms for the next exercises. So I'll just do them directly in here, just so that you guys aren't being left over time. So the last thing that you can do with the next important thing that you can do with JavaScript is update an element. So for the updating of an element, basically you just change the inner HTML. I would pretty much never change the inner text. You can if you want, but I would highly recommend against it. So if we're taking a look, for example, at that starter code from the from that same exercise that you just tried, you can see here we're getting the this text right here, this text element that has hello world inside of it. So what we can do instead is once we have that, we can actually just go in here and we can say text dot inner HTML is equal to goodbye world, like that. And then now if we go ahead and refresh this, whenever we click this, it'll actually, oh, sorry, this is the same presenting, right? Yeah. So once we actually have the text elements there, let me just quickly see text.inner HTML. Yeah, let me just quickly try it in here. Maybe that's not working. So document.get element by ID. And then in this case, we want to say the text element and we want to say .inner HTML. And we can just make that into goodbye world like that. And then you can see here, we've gone ahead and updated it. I think actually what I forgot to do here is, like I said before, with buttons, you can use them to call JavaScript. The way you do that is you type in on click and then you type in the function name. So you can just say update text like that. And then now if we refresh this and click it, it'll change for us. Okay, and that was basically the example that we were going to take a look at right there. And then the last thing is element attributes. So if you ever need to find an attribute or something, you can just do .has attribute to check if it exists. That'll be a Boolean that'll return true or false if it exists or not. And then you can say .set attribute or .remove attribute to change things. So if you say .set attribute category to tech, for example, then that would basically add this category right here, and it would set it to tech instead of being what it is right now. And you can remove an attribute by just saying that as well. So if you ever need to change any of the attributes on anything as you're going, you can do it using this. And from here, basically we have that same button starter code from before. Essentially what we're doing is just going to go through and do the exact same thing that we saw before, except for instead of having the inner text be hello world, we're going to change it to a number. So give me 2 seconds here. Let me just quickly pop open this. Exercises, button display. That one is JavaScript button starter. Okay. So here it is here. And I'll just pop it open here. So we basically just have this button. We have a number inside of it. All we're going to want to do is we're going to want to do number dot number. So we already have the element. So we want to do number dot inner HTML. And then that'll be our like number right here. So we're going to say that that is going to be equal to, so x is equal to number.inner HTML. And we're going to want to make that into an integer. So we can say parse int of that value. And then basically what we're going to want to do is just say x plus equals to 1. And then say that document dot number dot inner HTML is equal to x at this point. So basically, as we're going through, we're going to increment it and then go from there. And then we're just going to say on click is equal to increment like that. And then now every time it's going to add 1 to the value that currently exists there and then reset the inner HTML of that to that. So I go ahead and refresh. You can see here, we're now going up by 1 every time. So that's where that parsing things into integers and floats becomes super important, is to be able to do modifications like that as you go. If you want to change styles, you can do element.style dot and then whatever the style is. So color and then font size, instead of being font dash size, it's uppercase. So instead of font dash size, you go font size with an uppercase S, and then you can just change that like that there. And creating elements, this is how you can do it. This is much more complicated. 9 times out of 10, if you're trying to create elements, you're probably doing something wrong. If you can, just set the inner HTML of whatever the element is that's above it to whatever that new element is, instead of trying to do this and create new elements and stuff like that. You can actually just set, for example, within a div, you can just set the inner HTML to include a new element and go from there instead of having to create these elements like this, because this is much more complicated. And this is some information about full screen and how to do that if you're interested for like doing full screen images. And that's basically everything. So that was the end of the day today. We covered quite a bit again today. So if you have any questions and stuff like that, you can feel free to check them into the Discord for your mentors if you have any questions about anything. Next week, we're going to get onto the stuff that we were going to cover this week about how to create websites from templates. So we're going to be taking templates like these and creating our own websites using them. So yeah, be sure to show up here for next week, and we'll see you then.